Okay, I'm ready to say hello and welcome. Today I'm interviewing Simon Carmel. Simon has a long history doing different things for the deaf community, and he has made remarkable contributions. But for today, I will focus on his books. Why is his book so interesting? It focuses on his experience as a deaf magician while traveling all over the world. So I would like to get some of his background story. He started doing magic when he was only 4 years old. And then, at the age of 13, he received his first prize in the citywide magic tournament in Baltimore, Maryland. He worked with world-famous magician, the late Harry Blackson Sr. For many years, he gave different shows in the US, Canada, Europe, and other parts of the world. Wow, those are great photos. Performances were given to both deaf and hearing audiences. He won the Grand Prix Award at the World Deaf Magicians Festival in London in 1998. He has written many articles and books for Magic Magazine. Now we are here to talk with him. He has over 80 years of experience in just of his 3 books. Would you like to show your books for us? Silent Magic.
That's the first book. The second book is this.
Invisible Magic. Cool.
And the third
third book, Out of the Magic Cloak. All of these are biographies.
Yes, I'm currently working on a 4th book called Wizards in the Silent World. It will be published at the end of this year or in early 2022.
I'm looking forward to reading that one too. I'm so excited. Thank you for offering your time to discuss your books with our community. I do have a few questions for this interview. The first question is, tell us a brief summary about your 3 books, and soon to be 4th, about your experience as a deaf magician.
As you know, I started getting involved with magic when I was 4 years old. At the time, I did not think about how many deaf magicians were out there. Later on, I became curious with the number of deaf magicians around the world. So I took action and published a newspaper ad. For example, this piece that was published.
A search for deaf lady magicians. That's definitely important emphasis for
Yes,
women.
this was also published.
Biographies of deaf magicians.
As a result of these searches, I received a response from 20 deaf performers. This was in 1966. In 1967, after picking out some performers, I sent out a flyer promoting a search for deaf magicians in a hearing magic magazine.
GNU. Okay. Wow, amazing history.
This also went in different deaf magazines and newspapers that were sent out, but this helped me get a good number of deaf magicians to help write my books. However, my friend, John Schrodel, and I also worked together. To learn how to write articles about deaf magicians' backgrounds. For example, NAD magazine.
So awesome. Deaf magicians amaze the audience. 1970. Amazing.
The purpose of this article was to pull all deaf magicians to show up at the NAD conference, where they would have international deaf magicians for the first ever International Deaf Magicians Tournament, which took place in Minnesota in the summer of 1970. There was also a magician from Canada joining the U.S. team for International Deaf Magicians Tournament. It was a success. Everyone enjoyed themselves. They enjoyed seeing different deaf magicians. Back then, I was in business with the skiing team program for many years and decided to resign in 1990. It was around that time that I decided to come up with a plan to write a book, but put that on hold. At the time, I was teaching at RIT, NTID, and Gallaudet. After I retired, I left New York and moved to Florida, in which I finally took the time to prepare to write my first book. That's when I published my first book, Silent Magic. This book included only biographies of deaf American magicians. At the time, I did not think about including international magicians in my first book. One day, I went to the World Deaf Magicians Festival and saw so many foreign deaf magicians. And that's when I began feeling guilty. I then began interviewing them for my second book, Invisible Magic. That's the book I started involving deaf international magicians. But that wasn't all. I then came to find that there were more deaf magicians. So I went ahead and interviewed them as well. That was the inspiration behind my third book. The third book also includes Houdini, the famous hearing magician, who is well known for his stunt of escaping shackles, all while hanging upside down. I found that he met many deaf magicians. This made me wonder who the magicians were. So I asked the hearing magician writer if Houdini knew sign language. The writer told me he had no idea of such thing. But I myself found out that Houdini was indeed fluent in both British and ASL fingerspelling. There is nothing written at all about this, so I included this in one chapter of my book. The hearing magician was surprised that Houdini knew sign language and fingerspelling. Houdini once gave a show to 700 British people in London, March of 1920. There, he not only performed, but also used British Sign Language to explain what next tricks he had planned during his performance. Once I finished the third book with this information, I, of course, came across even more deaf magicians, which brings the number up to 43. Including one Chinese deaf magician. I do have the list somewhere. I had a wonderful interview with the Chinese deaf magician, as well as other countries' deaf magicians. I thought that was enough for me to stop there, because I had plans to write a book on deaf folklore in the future.
I'm really curious to know, what's your inspiration for writing these books? Do you believe that your faith in Judaism is an inspiration, or being deaf, or both? Had a part in your motivation to write those books?
Judaism has nothing to do with my book writing. My book writing has more to do with deaf individuals. That was my way of letting the deaf community know that we have many deaf magicians around the world. In fact, we are now up to 300 deaf magicians worldwide, including female deaf magicians. This was exciting for me to write, because it is something profound that can't be ignored in history, the fact that deaf magicians have existed and continue to exist.
Thank you. What is something that you want people to learn from your books?
I want people to enjoy reading my books and get an idea of how deaf magicians became involved with magic. Most deaf magicians have stated that their parents, relatives, and friends have given them magic boxes as Christmas gifts, Hanukkah gifts, birthday parties, and special occasions. That's how they became enamored with becoming deaf magicians. Other deaf magicians have said that they became inspired from simply watching magic shows on TV. Keeping myself motivated. I simply do not want deaf magicians to be overlooked in the history of magicians. I do not want to lose that drive toward deaf magicians.
I agree. We wanted to show, like you mentioned, Houdini being in your books. There's deaf gain from working with us because he learned sign language and facial expression, which helped him to provide a better performance on the stage. I think it's really important to note that we deaf people can contribute to our society everywhere, including in magic.
Absolutely. Houdini and his deaf magician friends were not mentioned in magician books until I found out that information. I want hearing magicians writers in the future to ensure that they do include Houdini's experiences with deaf magicians and the fact he mastered his fingerspelling.
I agree. Can you share your experience getting your books published? Was it easy or hard? What advice would you give a deaf writer who wants to become published?
Okay, so the first book I wanted to publish on deaf magicians. I contacted a publisher who is also involved with magic, and he has experience with the language of magic. I hired him to look over the book with the correct wordings. We have had a wonderful relationship for almost 20 years. I have known him for many years. And he also owns his publishing company in Florida, which is where I now live. It's easy for me to maintain a close relationship with him. Sometimes I would drive to meet and chat with him. I would show him pictures, papers, and books. Now, my advice to Jewish deaf writers is to reach out to famous writers and get feedback from them. Additionally, I would suggest contacting Jewish publishers with competence in the context of Jewish terminology in order to convey the message of Jewish deaf writers.
Thank you. That's some very valuable advice. Do you have any last words to share with us? Something that you look forward to?
Yes, I would like to see more deaf people be encouraged to write books, regardless of their English language proficiency. I've learned that it doesn't matter. Someone will help. I've also learned that hearing novelists always depend on their publishers and editors to edit their texts. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. For me, for example, my language is fine, but it's just a matter of using the right terminology. This is why I chose a publisher who is familiar with magic so he can make the correct changes. Do not be afraid to write.
This is great advice. I really appreciate you sharing. Is there anything else you want to add about your books or anything we can expect from you in the future? I know that you plan to write a 4th book.
After my 4th book gets published, I will start editing my manuscript of deaf folklore. It is almost done, but it will be ready maybe within the next 2 years. I know it is a long waiting. People have been waiting for my book, Deaf Folklore, for many years. I can't wait for my 4th book to be completed before moving on to the next. I have another project on magical mathematics for mathematical students and professors at colleges and universities.
Thank you so much for all your hard work, for writing, documenting, and as a result, inspiring all of us. Your work is so important. This interview today is official documentation that will always be available to our future generations, including your valuable advice. Thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
My greatest pleasure. Bye.
Bye.